Hey guys, tonight we step into the strange theatrical and deeply exaggerated world of Tudor England, an age of glittering courts, nervous nobles, questionable medical advice, and enough propaganda to make a modern political campaign look subtle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. One of the biggest lies people still believe about Tudor England is that absolutely everyone smelled horrific all the time. According to modern imagination, the entire country existed inside one giant invisible cloud made of sweat, mud, onions, wet sheep, and emotional suffering. Films love portraying Tudor people as permanently filthy creatures stumbling through fog while coughing dramatically into straw. And yes, Tudor cities absolutely smelled bad. London especially was crowded, smoky, loud, and filled with enough human and animal waste to make modern sanitation engineers burst into tears immediately. Streets were covered in mud, horse manure, rotten food, and things nobody asked too many questions about. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows directly into the streets below, which made walking through London less of a pleasant stroll and more of a tactical military exercise. The rivers often looked like it had personally given up on humanity. But despite all this, Tudor people themselves cared deeply about hygiene. They washed their hands, faces, and bodies whenever possible. Wealthier households bought scented soaps, oils, perfumes, and herbal rinses imported from Europe. Clean linen underclothes were considered essential because people believed fresh linen absorbed sweat and dirt from the body. In many ways, they treated clean shirts the way modern people treat therapy apps. Nobles at core were especially obsessed with smell. Pleasant scents represented wealth, health, and sophistication. Wealthy men and women carried pomanders filled with flowers, spices, ambergris, and herbs to block foul odor around them, which honestly makes sense. If someone emptied a chamber pot near your front door every morning, you too would probably carry emergency cinnamon at all times. Even poor households attempted regular washing when they had access to water and time. Public bathhouses had existed for centuries, though many declined after outbreaks of disease caused people to associate communal baths with sickness and prostitution. Humanity once again demonstrating its remarkable ability to solve one problem by creating two completely different problems. The myth survives because modern people compare Tudor hygiene to modern plumbing, which is unfair. Future historians will probably judge us too. Imagine explaining energy drinks, artificial cheese powder, and people screaming at strangers online about celebrities they have never met. Archaeologists of the future may simply ray us out of respect. Of course, Tudor England still smelled unpleasant overall. Dentistry was terrifying. Sewage systems barely functioned, and many streets essentially operated as open-air experiments in bacterial optimism. But the idea that Tudors proudly wandered around marinating in filth for months is mostly fiction. They dislike bad smells just as much as we do. They simply lack deodorant, indoor plumbing, and the revolutionary modern invention known as not throwing human waste directly outside. One of the biggest misconceptions about Tudor England is the idea that Henry VIII spent his entire life as a gigantic, furious king, slowly roaming through castles while demanding executions and roasted meat every 15 minutes. Late in life, yes, he absolutely became enormous. By his final years, Henry struggled to walk properly, suffered from severe leg ulcers, and reportedly needed special devices to help move his body around the palace. Court servants had the deeply unfortunate responsibility of assisting a king who had essentially become a heavily decorated avalanche. But young Henry was almost unrecognizable compared to the man he later became. In his youth, Henry was considered one of the most impressive princes in Europe. He was tall, athletic, educated, charming, and obsessed with physical competition. He hunted for hours, wrestled, jousted in dangerous tournaments, played tennis, danced at court celebrations, and constantly tried to display his strength and elegance. Foreign ambassadors praised his appearance constantly. Some described him as the perfect Renaissance prince. He had bright red gold hair, powerful legs from years of riding, and endless confidence. If Tudor England had fitness influences, Henry would absolutely have been standing in front of polished armor, whispering about discipline and greatness before immediately eating an entire swan. He also loved fashion with terrifying intensity. Henry wore silk, velvet, jewels, embroidered fabrics, golden chains, feathered hats, and padded outfits, designed to make him appear even broader and more dominant. Some of his clothes were so overloaded with decoration that he probably jingled slightly while walking through corridors. Everything began changing after years of injuries and political stress. The most important turning point came during a jousting accident when Henry was thrown from his horse and badly injured. Historians believe the accident permanently damaged his health and possibly affected his personality as well. As his physical condition worsened, Henry became less active, gained enormous weight, and grew increasingly paranoid. Chronic pain from infected leg wounds followed him constantly. Advisors disappeared from favor suddenly. Court politics became more dangerous. Wives learned that royal marriage occasionally ended with unexpected appointments beside execution blocks. The truth is far more uncomfortable than the myth. Henry was not born as a monstrous tyrant. He slowly transformed into one through pain, fear, unchecked power, and years of surrounding himself with people too terrified to tell him no, which, historically speaking, rarely improves anyone's personality. One of the most persistent myths about Tudor England is the idea that women had absolutely no influence and spent their entire lives silently sewing beside fireplaces while men handled politics, business, and important decisions. Now, Tudor society was undeniably patriarchal. Men controlled most official positions of authority. Women faced major legal restrictions, and marriage often determined a woman's entire future. But the popular image of Tudor women as powerless decorative furniture is deeply misleading. In reality, women constantly influenced Tudor society in ways both visible and hidden. Noble women managed enormous households that functioned almost like small governments. They supervised servants, handled finances, arranged marriages, organized supplies, oversaw education, and maintained family alliances. Running a large Tudor estate required intelligence, diplomacy, and enough patience to survive daily interactions with ambitious relatives wearing wool tights. And honestly, surviving Tudor relatives probably deserved military medals. Many women also worked outside noble life. Women brewed ale, sold goods in markets, managed shops, worked in textiles, and helped run family businesses. Widows especially could gain surprising independence because they sometimes inherited property or commercial responsibilities. Then there was Elizabeth the Fair, who spent decades ruling England. While male advisors repeatedly attempted to explain leadership to the actual Queen of England, a truly timeless male tradition, Elizabeth understood politics brilliantly. She transformed her public image into a weapon. Her speeches, portraits, clothing, and behavior were all carefully controlled to project authority and stability. She delayed marriage negotiations strategically, using foreign princes like pieces on a diplomatic chessboard while avoiding the danger of surrendering political power to a husband. Because Tudor marriage was not romantic equality, a husband often gained enormous control over his wife's property, influence, and decisions. Elizabeth recognized this perfectly. Of course, life remained brutally unfair for many ordinary women. Domestic abuse was common. Education opportunities were limited. Childbirth was dangerous. And social expectations were extremely strict. A woman's reputation could collapse from rumors alone. Tudor society judged women constantly, often by standards invented 5 minutes earlier by nervous religious men. But women still shape politics, economies, religion, and family life every single day. The myth survives partly because history books spent centuries focusing almost entirely on powerful men. Meanwhile, countless women quietly managed households, businesses, estates, and political alliances, while the men around them posed dramatically for portraits and developed very serious opinions about hats. Which, in fairness, Tudor hats were extremely serious business. One of the strangest myths people still believe about the Tudor era is that everyone thought the earth was flat until modern civilization heroically arrived to rescue humanity from stupidity. According to this version of history, Tudor sailors supposedly stood nervously on ships whispering, "Careful, lads, we're getting dangerously close to the edge of existence," which would have made global exploration somewhat difficult. In reality, educated Europeans had known the earth was round for centuries. Ancient Greek scholars had already calculated the earth's circumference. Long before the Tudor dynasty even existed, medieval universities taught the concept openly, and Tudor navigators absolutely understood it. Sailors used astronomy, maps, and mathematical calculations regularly. The idea of a spherical earth was not controversial among educated people. What people argued about was not whether the earth was round, but how big it actually was. This misunderstanding became important during the Age of Exploration. Christopher Columbus, for example, incorrectly believed Asia was much closer to Europe than it really was. He accidentally encountered continents standing directly in the way of his calculations. An awkward moment historically, though probably exciting for geography. The flat earth medieval people myth became popular much later, especially during the 19th century. Writers and intellectuals wanted to portray earlier centuries as hopelessly ignorant, so modern society would appear dramatically enlightened by comparison, which is funny because future historians will probably look at us and wonder why we willingly consumed fluorescent energy drinks while arguing online with strangers named things like Dragon King, 6942. Every generation believes it has finally defeated human stupidity forever. Every generation is immediately proven wrong. Tudor people may have believed some questionable things. Of course, astrology influenced medicine, commits terrified populations, and many people thought illness came from bad air drifting around cities like invisible punishment smoke. To be fair, after walking through Tudor London, the air probably did feel personally hostile, but educated Tudors understood astronomy surprisingly well for the time. Navigation improved rapidly during the 16th century, and explorers depended on sophisticated calculations while traveling enormous distances. No sailor feared falling off the edge of the planet. They feared storms, starvation, disease, pirates, shipwrecks, mutiny, and dying slowly somewhere unfamiliar, while a captain insisted everything was completely under control, which honestly sounds much more realistic. The real lesson here is not that Tudor people were foolish. It is that history often gets rewritten into simplified stories where the past becomes dramatically dumber than it actually was, mostly because complicated truth is less convenient than feeling superior to dead people. Modern people often imagine Tudor food as endless bowls of grey soup eaten sadly beside candles, while someone nearby dies of plague. According to films, every meal in Tudor England looked like punishment for losing a bet. But the reality was far more complicated, and honestly far stranger. Wealthy Tudor households ate enormous varieties of food. Royal feasts included roasted meats, pies, fish, cheeses, fruits, pastries, custards, sugared desserts, imported wines, and exotic spices from Asia and the Middle East. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and saffron were prized symbols of wealth. If your dinner contained enough spice, people assumed you were important or dangerously irresponsible with money. Banquets became elaborate theatrical performances. Noble tables displayed dozens of dishes at once, sometimes more for visual intimidation than actual eating. Sugar sculptures shaped like castles, animals, or mythological scenes decorated feasts. Some pies even contained live birds released dramatically during meals because apparently, Tudor nobles occasionally planned dinners, the same way modern people planned gender reveal parties with similarly confusing levels of chaos. The rich especially loved showing off through food. A roasted peacock could be served with its colorful feathers reattached afterward, so guests could admire the bird before eating it, which feels unnecessarily aggressive toward the peacock. Honestly, poorer Tudors naturally ate simpler diets. Bread, cheese, pottage, vegetables, onions, oats and ale formed the backbone of daily meals for ordinary families. Meat existed, but was less common for poorer households. Seasonal foods mattered enormously because refrigeration did not exist. Winter diets could become repetitive very quickly. Imagine spending months staring at turnips while trying to convince yourself this counts as culinary excitement. Still, Tudor cooking was not flavorless survival food. People used herbs constantly. Rosemary, sage, parsley, thyme, and mint appeared in many dishes. Cooking techniques were surprisingly advanced, especially in wealthy kitchens staffed by professional cooks. Of course, Tudor cuisine also included recipes that sound deeply concerning today. Wealthy people consumed swan, porpoise, and occasionally things modern menus wisely avoid mentioning. Medical theories about food were equally bizarre. Certain foods were believed to affect personality, emotions, or bodily balance. Eating incorrectly could supposedly transform your entire health, which, to be fair, modern internet wellness influences are not dramatically different. The biggest misconception is that Tudor people lived on miserable food because they lacked sophistication. In truth, food was central to Tudor culture, status, hospitality, and entertainment. Humanity has always loved overeating at social gatherings, while pretending it is somehow historically important. One of the most repeated myths about Tudor England is the claim that people drank beer constantly because water was too dangerous to consume. According to the internet, The average Tudor citizen apparently woke up each morning, drank 6 mugs of ale before breakfast, and stumbled through life mildly intoxicated until death arrived sometime around age 32. Reality, as always, is less dramatic and slightly more disappointing. Tudor people absolutely drank water. Wells, springs, rivers, rainwater systems, and local streams provided water for daily life. In rural areas especially, clean water sources were often perfectly usable. People understood the difference between fresh water and water that looked like it had personally witnessed several crimes. Now, cities were another matter. London's water quality could become genuinely unpleasant due to overcrowding, sewage, industrial waste, dead animals, and humanity generally behaving like sanitation was somebody else's problem. The River Thames occasionally resembled a giant moving warning sign. So yes, ale and beer became extremely common beverages, but not because everyone was terrified of water itself. Beer was nutritious, filling, affordable, and safer in some urban environments because the brewing process boiled water during production. Weak ale called small beer was consumed daily by adults and children because it contained very low alcohol levels while providing calories and hydration. Essentially, Tudor people invented the concept of drinking something slightly depressing throughout the workday centuries before office coffee culture. Alcohol also played a major social role. Taverns and alehouses were important gathering places where people exchanged gossip, discussed politics, argued loudly, conducted business, and occasionally solved disagreements by throwing furniture at one another. So, honestly, not dramatically different from parts of the modern internet, but the idea that everyone walked around permanently drunk is exaggerated heavily. Excessive drunkenness still existed, of course, and authorities often complained about disorderly drinking. Religious leaders especially loved delivering long speeches about morality while standing before populations that simply wanted one peaceful evening without plague, taxes, or agricultural disaster. Tudor life was difficult. A mild drink probably helped psychologically. The myth survives because modern people here, ale was common, and immediately imagine medieval chaos fueled entirely by alcohol. But Tudor people still needed to work constantly. Farming, labor, cooking, trade, and survival required functioning coordination. Most people could not spend every day unconscious in a ditch dramatically singing folk songs about cabbage, though statistically at least one man probably tried. Modern people often assume that Tudor doctors were basically early versions of modern physicians, perhaps less advanced, but still guided by logic and medical understanding. This is an extremely generous interpretation. Tudor medicine was a strange mixture of genuine observation, herbal knowledge, superstition, astrology, and complete chaos held together by confidence alone. Doctors believed the human body depended on balancing 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you became sick, physicians assumed one of these invisible fluids had become dramatic. Treatments focused on restoring balance. This often involved bloodletting, purging, vomiting, sweating, fasting, herbal mixtures, or applying substances that sound less like medicine and more like ingredients discovered during a kitchen accident. If you survived, the treatment was considered successful. If you died, the illness was apparently very severe, an impressively flexible system. Astrology also played a major role in medicine. Doctors consulted star charts before performing procedures because many believed planetary movements affected the body directly. Imagine arriving with severe stomach pain only to hear your physician mutter, "Unfortunately, Saturn appears irritated today." That would not inspire confidence. Surprisingly, not all Tudor medicine was useless. Some herbal remedies genuinely worked. Certain plants had calming antibacterial or pain-relieving properties. Experienced healers understood practical treatments for wounds, fevers, and infections better than people often assume. But surgery was absolutely horrifying. Without anesthesia, patients were physically restrained, while surgeons operated as quickly as possible. Speed mattered more than precision, because screaming patients tended to move around inconveniently during amputations. Surgical tools were cleaned poorly, infections spread easily, and survival depended heavily on luck, strength, and whether your surgeon had slept recently. Dentistry was somehow even worse. Tooth extraction involved iron tools, brute force, and emotional acceptance. Wealthy Tudors consumed enormous amounts of sugar, which destroyed their teeth rapidly. By middle age, many nobles suffered chronic pain, blackened teeth, and infections. Even Elizabeth I reportedly developed severe dental problems from excessive sugar consumption. which means history's most powerful queen was ultimately defeated by desert. The strangest part is that Tudor doctors genuinely believed they were helping people. Medicine was respected, difficult, and intellectually serious for its time. Physicians studied ancient texts carefully and tried to understand the body using the knowledge available to them. Unfortunately, the available knowledge occasionally suggested that bleeding sick people repeatedly was somehow an excellent long-term strategy. Humanity has always been surprisingly confident while being completely wrong. One of the biggest myths surrounding Elizabeth I is the idea that she simply hated romance, rejected all affection, and proudly decided from childhood that marriage was unnecessary. The reality was far more complicated and far more political. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by disastrous marriages. Her father, Henry VIII, had wives executed, discarded, humiliated, or buried with alarming efficiency. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, lost her head before Elizabeth even turned 3 years old. So, from an early age, Elizabeth learned an important Tudor lesson. Royal marriage was less of a romantic partnership and more of a highly decorated survival gamble. And the odds were terrible. As queen, Elizabeth faced enormous pressure to marry. Advisors, foreign ambassadors, parliament, and random men with excessive confidence constantly insisted she needed a husband. Marriage was considered essential for producing an heir and stabilizing the kingdom. But marriage also carried enormous risks. In Tudor society, husbands traditionally gained authority over wives. Even queens faced expectations of obedience within marriage. Elizabeth understood that marrying the wrong man could weaken her political control, divide the court, or drag England into dangerous foreign alliances. So instead, she turned indecision into strategy. For years, Elizabeth entertained marriage negotiations with European princes and noblemen without fully committing to anyone. She flirted diplomatically, encouraged possibilities, delayed answers, and used her unmarried status as political leverage. Entire governments spent years nervously waiting for her decisions while Elizabeth calmly continued being queen. Honestly, it was one of the greatest long-term, maybe later performances in history. This does not mean Elizabeth lacked emotional attachments. Her relationship with Robert Dudley appears especially close, and rumors about them spread constantly through the court. But marrying Dudley would have created massive political scandal, especially after the suspicious death of his wife. Tudor England loved gossip with terrifying dedication. Meanwhile, Elizabeth carefully crafted the image of the Virgin Queen. Portraits showed her almost as a supernatural figure untouched by ordinary human weakness. Her unmarried status transformed from political vulnerability into national propaganda. And it worked brilliantly. By refusing marriage, Elizabeth avoided surrendering authority to her husband and maintained direct control over her kingdom for decades. She essentially looked at centuries of dangerous royal marriages and decided absolutely not, which, considering Tudor history, was probably one of the most emotionally intelligent decisions ever made by a monarch. Though admittedly, watching foreign ambassadors spend years trying to decode her intentions was likely an added bonus. One of the most exaggerated myths about Tudor England is the idea that everyone married at 12 years old and immediately began producing heirs while still emotionally recovering from learning basic arithmetic. This belief usually comes from people reading about royal families and assuming all of society behaved the same way. In reality, most ordinary Tudor people married much later. For common men and women, marriage required something extremely inconvenient: financial stability. Couples needed enough money to support a household, buy supplies, rent property, and survive periods of bad harvest or unemployment. Because even in the 16th century, Romans unfortunately remained attached to economics. Most women married in their early to mid-20s, while men often married slightly later after establishing work or apprenticeships. Marriage was not simply about love. It was about survival, labor, inheritance, and building a functioning household together. Now, noble families were different. Among the aristocracy, marriages were often political arrangements designed to secure alliances, property, titles, or royal favor. Betrothals between very young nobles did happen. Sometimes children were promised to one another years before adulthood. But even then, actual married life was often delayed until later teenage years. The internet tends to hear betrothal and immediately imagine fully grown political marriages involving children managing castles before puberty. History is strange enough already without adding unnecessary drama. Royal families especially distorted public perception. The Tudors themselves were obsessed with succession and dynastic security. Producing heirs became a national political issue, If a monarch failed to create enough surviving children, entire kingdoms could collapse into civil war, which honestly puts modern family pressure into perspective slightly. Life expectancy also confuses people. Tudor averages appear low, mainly because infant mortality was horrifyingly high. Many children died young from disease or malnutrition, but adults who survived childhood could live into their 50s, 60s, or beyond. The myth survives partly because modern audiences prefer dramatic historical narratives. Everyone in history married at 12 and lived miserably. Sounds shocking and emotionally satisfying. The truth is more ordinary. Most Tudor people worried about work, food, rent, marriage prospects, bad weather, illness, taxes, and whether their neighbors were secretly insane, which unfortunately remains a fairly timeless human experience. And despite popular imagination, most parents in Tudor England were not looking at their 13-year-old children and thinking, excellent time to discuss mortgage responsibilities and political alliances. Even the Tudors had limits. Usually, modern portrayals of Tudor England often make it seem like every single person spent the entire day praying, fearing hell, and discussing religion with terrifying intensity, while church bells echoed dramatically in the background. And to be fair, religion absolutely dominated Tudor society. Church attendance was expected. Religious festivals shaped the calendar. People prayed regularly, believed in heaven and hell, and feared divine punishment very seriously. Religion influenced law, politics, education, medicine, and daily behavior. Even ordinary conversations were filled with religious language. But this does not mean every Tudor person walked around in a permanent state of spiritual enlightenment. Many people practiced religion because society demanded it. Others followed rituals out of habit, fear, family tradition, or simple survival. Public conformity mattered enormously in Tudor England. Having the wrong religious beliefs could become less of a personal issue and more of a rapid appointment with government officials carrying ropes. The English Reformation made everything even more chaotic. Under Henry VIII, England broke away from the authority of the Pope after the king failed to secure an annulment for his marriage. Suddenly, churches, prayers, and religious authority all began changing under royal command. Then came Edward VI, whose reign pushed England further toward Protestant reforms. After him, Mary I restored Catholicism aggressively, leading to the execution of hundreds of Protestants. Then Elizabeth I shifted England back toward Protestantism once again. Imagine trying to survive while the government changed the correct version of Christianity every few years. One decade you are attending Mass safely. The next decade, the same behavior could make you politically suspicious. Then suddenly the rules reverse again, because the monarch has changed. Ordinary people adapted however they could. Some genuinely cared deeply about theology and risked death for their beliefs. Others simply tried to avoid trouble and continue farming without accidentally committing religious crimes during breakfast, which honestly sounds emotionally exhausting. The government used religion partly as a tool for stability and obedience. Public unity mattered enormously, especially after decades of political instability and civil conflict. Religious disagreement was seen as dangerous because leaders feared rebellion constantly. And considering Tudor history, they were not entirely paranoid. The myth that all Tudors were joyless religious fanatics ignores the complexity of human behavior. People laughed, gossiped, cheated, complained, drank heavily, spread rumors, flirted badly, and skipped responsibilities exactly as humans always have. They simply did all of it while surrounded by churches, and the constant possibility that someone nearby might accuse them of heresy for extremely inconvenient reasons. When people imagine Tudor fashion, they usually picture nobles trapped inside enormous layers of fabric, barely able to breathe while slowly collapsing beneath the weight of velvet and poor decisions. And honestly, sometimes that was accurate. Tudor fashion could be extremely elaborate, especially among the wealthy. Nobles wore padded doublets, heavy gowns, embroidered sleeves, jeweled collars, silk stockings, cloaks lined with fur, and hats large enough to develop their own political opinions. Clothing was not just about appearance. It was a public display of wealth, status, and power. The richer you were, the less practical your outfit became. This remains surprisingly consistent throughout history. But the idea that all Tudor clothing was unbearably uncomfortable all the time is exaggerated. Much of it was actually designed for practical daily use. Wool kept people warm in cold English weather. Linen helped absorb sweat. And layered clothing protected against rain and dirt surprisingly well. Working class people especially wore simpler clothes built for movement and labor. Farmers, servants, craftsmen, and merchants needed durable garments that allowed them to work long hours. Nobody was trying to milk cows while dressed like a decorative curtain from a royal banquet hall. Tudor tailoring was also more advanced than many people realize. Skilled tailor carefully adjusted clothing for fit and comfort, especially among wealthier households. Good clothing represented investment. Fabric was expensive and garments were often repaired, reused, altered, or passed down through generations. Even children inherited clothing constantly, which meant somewhere in Tudor England, a frustrated child was absolutely complaining about wearing old family outfits, while a parent insisted they should be grateful. Another timeless human tradition. Of course, fashion still produced some deeply questionable trends. Men wore padded codpieces that became increasingly absurd during parts of the 16th century. Sleeves expanded dramatically. Some noble outfits became so overloaded with decoration that walking through doorways probably required strategic planning. Court fashion prioritized appearance above practicality because clothing communicated political importance instantly. If you entered court looking modest or poorly dressed, people assumed you lacked influence. Essentially, Tudor nobles turned themselves into heavily embroidered advertisements. But ordinary Tudor clothing was often practical, durable, and surprisingly functional for the environment people lived in. The myth survives because films focus heavily on royalty and court life, where fashion naturally became more extreme. Because if humans gain enough money and free time, history suggests they eventually begin attaching unnecessary fabric to themselves for reasons nobody fully understands anymore. Modern movies and documentaries often make Tudor England look like one endless execution parade, where every disagreement immediately ended with somebody dramatically losing their head in front of a shocked crowd. To be fair, Tudor punishments could be brutally violent. Executions were public spectacles designed to frighten people into obedience. Traitors could be hanged, drawn, and quartered in punishments so horrifying that even describing them fully sounds like a medieval writer trying too hard to impress other medieval writers. Beheading was considered a more honorable death, especially for nobles, which is a strange sentence when you stop and think about it for more than 4 seconds. But despite the Tudor reputation for bloodshed, most ordinary people were not witnessing executions every week while casually shopping for onions. Public executions were relatively uncommon events for average citizens, which is partly why they attracted enormous crowds whenever they happened. People traveled to watch them because they were dramatic, terrifying, and socially important. Human beings, unfortunately, have always treated public disaster as a form of entertainment. The Tudors simply removed smartphones from the equation. Most people lived ordinary lives focused on work, food, survival, religion, and avoiding disease. They were not constantly dodging executioners around every street corner, like characters in an especially stressful adventure game. Still, the fear was real. Tudor governments used punishment very deliberately to maintain authority. Treason laws became especially dangerous under rulers like Henry VIII, when criticizing royal policy could rapidly become life-threatening. Speaking carelessly at the wrong tavern could ruin entire families, and Tudor England absolutely loved accusations. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Religious tensions created suspicion everywhere. Court politics became survival contests disguised as elegant conversations. Smiling politely at dinner, while secretly planning someone's destruction, was practically a political skill, especially at court, where trust had roughly the lifespan of warm milk. The most famous executions involved political or religious figures precisely because they were shocking. The deaths of Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, and many others echoed across Europe because they demonstrated how unstable royal favor could become. One day you were advising the king. The next day, you were receiving very unpleasant feedback from a man holding an axe. The myth survives because executions make Tudor history feel dramatic and cinematic. But most Tudors were not living inside non-stop terror every waking moment. They were living ordinary lives under a government that occasionally reminded everyone in extremely public fashion that obedience was highly encouraged. One of the biggest misconceptions about Tudor England is the belief that royal portraits were realistic representations of people. Modern audiences often look at these paintings and assume they function like historical photographs. They absolutely did not. Tudor portraits were carefully engineered propaganda designed to communicate power, wealth, authority, and legitimacy. Painters were not hired to capture brutal honesty. They were hired to make monarchs look impressive enough that nobody questioned their right to rule. Because telling it to the king, "I tried realism," was not always a healthy career choice. Take Henry VIII, for example. In many famous portraits, he appears enormous, broad-shouldered, dominant, and almost physically unstoppable. Artists emphasized his strength deliberately. Wide stances, massive sleeves, expensive fabrics, jewels, and direct eye contact all projected authority. These paintings were essentially the 16th century equivalent of carefully edited social media profiles. Except instead of filters, artists used oil paint and fear. Elaborate clothing mattered enormously in portraits because appearance symbolized status. Gold embroidery, pearls, velvet, fur, and jewelry displayed wealth instantly. Monarchs wanted foreign ambassadors and subjects alike to see magnificence, stability, and control. Even posture became political. Then there was Elizabeth I, whose portraits became increasingly symbolic as she aged. Later paintings often portrayed her with unnaturally pale skin, flawless features, and eternal youth. Some portraits turned her almost into a mythological figure, glowing above ordinary humanity. The reality, unfortunately, involved aging, illness, stress, and severe dental problems caused partly by excessive sugar consumption. But Tudor propaganda had little interest in realism. Nobody wanted foreign powers. Staring at portraits, thinking the queen appears exhausted and slightly fragile, that inspires invasion, not loyalty. Portraits also contained hidden symbols everywhere. Pearls represented purity. Globes symbolized imperial ambition. Certain colors communicated wealth or dynastic legitimacy. Even tiny objects in the background could carry political meaning. Essentially, Tudor paintings were visual press releases disguised as art. And honestly, modern celebrity photography is not dramatically different. The myth survives because people instinctively trust images. We assume paintings show truth. But Tudor rulers understood something very important centuries before modern advertising agencies did. If you control the image, you control the story. And if the story looks glamorous enough, most people stop asking inconvenient questions about reality altogether. Modern people often imagine Tudor England as a backward world filled with ignorant peasants, dirty streets, and people accidentally dying because somebody sneezed near a turnip. Now, to be fair, Tudor life could absolutely be brutal. Disease spread easily, sanitation was weak, and medicine occasionally resembled organized guessing performed by confident men holding jars of herbs. But the idea that Tudor society was completely primitive is deeply misleading. The Tudor era was actually a period of enormous intellectual and technological change. Printing expanded rapidly across Europe, allowing books and ideas to spread faster than ever before. Literacy slowly increased. Universities grew in importance, and scholars became increasingly interested in science, navigation, engineering, and classical learning. This was the age of the Renaissance reaching England. People studied astronomy, mathematics, architecture, philosophy, and geography with genuine seriousness. Exploration expanded dramatically. Trade networks grew larger, and new discoveries constantly reshaped how people understood the world. Tudor shipbuilding alone became far more advanced than many people realize. English ships improved in speed, navigation, and firepower during the 16th century. Sailors crossed enormous oceans using mathematics, astronomy, maps, and instruments surprisingly sophisticated for the time. Of course, many voyages still ended with starvation, shipwrecks, mutiny, or someone loudly insisting they definitely knew where West was. Human. Progress rarely moves elegantly. The Tudors also developed impressive achievements in art, music, literature, and architecture. This was the world of William Shakespeare, elaborate royal palaces, growing theaters, and increasingly complex political diplomacy. Court politics itself became almost frighteningly sophisticated. Ambassadors exchanged coded letters. Spies gathered intelligence across Europe, and noble families maneuvered constantly for influence. Entire political careers could rise or collapse based on one poorly worded conversation during dinner, which honestly makes modern office politics seem relaxing by comparison. The myth survives partly because modern audiences focus heavily on Tudor failures. And yes, their medical knowledge was terrifying. Dentistry looked like punishment invented by angry blacksmiths. Hygiene remained limited by technology. Scientific understanding still mixed with superstition constantly. But future generations will probably judge us just as harshly. Imagine explaining processed food, reality television, internet conspiracy theories, and people recording themselves dancing in grocery stores for social validation. Historians of the future may conclude we collectively suffered head injuries. Every civilization believes it is far more advanced than the ones before it. Then history quietly waits a few centuries and humbles everyone equally. Modern films love portraying Tudor England as a world of endless luxury. Glittering palaces, candle-lit feasts, elegant dances, handsome nobles in velvet, and queens dramatically staring out rainy windows while orchestras play in the background. And yes, parts of Tudor life could look magnificent. Royal courts displayed enormous wealth. Banquets overflowed with expensive food. Musicians performed during feasts. Tapestries covered palace walls. And nobles dressed like they were competing in an international embroidery competition. Palaces such as Hampton Court projected power and splendor, designed to impress visitors from across Europe. But beneath all the glitter sat a deeply uncomfortable reality. Most Tudor people lived hard lives filled with exhausting labor, disease, uncertainty, and fear. Farmers worked endlessly just to survive bad harvests. Cities suffered outbreaks of plague regularly. Infant mortality was horrifyingly high. Medical treatment often made illness worse. Winters were cold, homes were smoky, and sanitation barely functioned. Even the rich were not truly safe. Court life looked glamorous from a distance, but it operated like a beautifully decorated psychological battlefield. Nobles competed constantly for royal favor, because one wrong alliance or careless statement could destroy entire families. Smiling politely, while secretly fearing political ruin became a normal survival skill, especially around rulers like Henry VIII. At court, luxury and paranoia existed side by side. One evening, you might attend an elaborate feast surrounded by music and gold plate. The next morning, someone you spoke with yesterday could suddenly be arrested for treason. Tudor politics moved with the emotional stability of a collapsing staircase. And then there was disease. People died from infections, childbirth, fevers, poor sanitation, contaminated wounds, and illnesses modern medicine treats easily today. Even minor injuries could become fatal. A simple tooth infection sometimes turned into a death sentence, which honestly makes modern dentistry bills feel slightly less insulting. The glamour survives in popular imagination because royalty naturally attracts attention. Beautiful clothing and dramatic castles are easier to romanticize than agricultural labor or dysentery. Films focus on queens dancing elegantly, not servants emptying chamber pots into streets while praying. Nobody looked up at the wrong moment. But the truth is what makes Tudor England fascinating. It was a world of beauty and brutality existing together constantly. Magnificent art stood beside public executions. Lavish feasts happened during years of hunger. Religious devotion mixed with political manipulation. Human beings pursued luxury, ambition, romance, and entertainment while surrounded by instability and death, which unfortunately sounds remarkably familiar. The Tudors were not glamorous fantasy characters living inside golden palaces untouched by reality. They were people, frightened, ambitious, dramatic, petty, intelligent, ruthless people wearing extremely uncomfortable sleeves while trying to survive history. The harbor of Alexandria smelled of salt water, fish, perfume, wet rope, and political anxiety. Ships from every corner of the Mediterranean crowded the docks beneath the towering lighthouse of Alexandria, unloading wine, marble, spices, scrolls, exotic animals, and occasionally diseases that would later become somebody else's historical problem. Tonight, however, the city focused on only one arrival. Mark Antony had returned to Egypt. The Roman general entered Alexandria with the confidence of a man who had won great battles and made terrible financial decisions. His soldiers marched behind him through crowded streets lined with merchants, priests, dancers, and citizens, pretending not to stare too hard at the famous Roman, whose personal life had become a public festival of rumors across the Mediterranean. Some claimed he planned to conquer the East. Others claimed he was already conquered, mostly by wine and by Cleopatra. Inside the royal palace, servants rushed through corridors carrying trays of figs, roasted duck, olives, honey cakes, and amphi of imported wine. Floors of polished marble reflected torchlight like still water. Silk curtains moved gently in the evening breeze drifting in from the sea. Musicians tuned their instruments nearby, while cooks argued over sources with the seriousness of military commanders preparing for war, because in a way, they were dinner with Cleopatra was never just dinner. Every cup, every chair, every piece of decoration carried meaning. Roman guests were seated carefully according to rank. Egyptian symbols were placed beside Greek statues to remind visitors that Cleopatra ruled over a kingdom older than Rome itself. Gold plates covered the tables in such absurd quantities that even wealthy senators occasionally forgot how to speak for a few seconds, which politically speaking was useful. Cleopatra understood spectacle better than almost anyone alive. She knew powerful men liked to imagine themselves in control, while quietly walking into carefully arranged traps made of luxury, praise, and astonishingly strong wine. And Antony walked willingly into all of it. When he finally entered the banquet hall, servants lowered their heads. Musicians began to play softly. Incense drifted through the chamber. At the far end of the room sat Cleopatra beneath golden lamplight, dressed in fine linen and jewels that probably cost more than several villages combined. She smiled as Antony approached. Rome's future had arrived for dinner, and historically, this was rarely a comforting sentence. The banquet hall of Alexandria glowed beneath hundreds of oil lamps suspended from painted ceilings. Their light flickered across marble walls, silver cups, and enough gold decoration to make visiting Roman senators briefly reconsider whether invading Egypt was actually worth the paperwork. Servants moved silently between tables carrying roasted peacock, oysters from the coast, stuffed dormice, lentils soaked in herbs, and enormous platters of fish covered in sauces whose ingredients were probably known only to priests and deeply exhausted kitchen workers. At the center of the hall sat Cleopatra and Mark Antony, reclining beside one another on embroidered couches while musicians played softly nearby. To an outsider, the evening looked romantic. To everyone with functioning political instincts, it looked terrifying because every sentence spoken across this table carried consequences for kingdoms, armies, and thousands of men currently standing in deserts, wondering why powerful leaders always solved international crises. With wine first, Cleopatra began carefully. She asked Antony about Rome, about the Senate, about the mood among the generals loyal to Octavian. Her voice remained calm and playful, but every question was precise. She gathered information the way Roman tax collectors gathered money, politely at first, then relentlessly. Antony answered with growing confidence as servants continued refilling his cup, which they did frequently, very frequently. Egyptian wine flowed through the room like a military strategy of its own. Thick red wine from the Nile Delta mixed with imported Greek vintages disappeared into silver goblets almost faster than the servants could carry them. Somewhere in the hall, one Roman officer attempted to stand up too quickly and nearly entered history as the man defeated by upholstery. Cleopatra noticed everything. When Antony laughed too loudly at a joke, she noticed when Roman officers exchanged nervous glances at the mention of Octavian. She noticed when senators became slightly more honest after their fourth cup of wine. She definitely noticed this was not indulgence. This was surveillance with appetizers. Outside, Alexandria remained alive deep into the night. Merchants shouted in distant streets. Ships creaked in the harbor. Waves struck the docks beneath the great lighthouse. But inside the palace, the atmosphere grew warmer, heavier, slower. And as the food continued arriving, the conversation shifted from friendly diplomacy toward dangerous promises. Promises about armies, about loyalty, about the future division of Rome itself. Somewhere beneath the music and laughter, everyone in the room understood the truth. Dinner was becoming the opening move of a war disguised as entertainment, which, to be fair, described a surprising amount of Roman politics. As the night deepened inside the palace of Alexandria, the banquet slowly transformed into something far more dangerous than a celebration. The music grew louder. The torches burned lower. Roman officers relaxed just enough to begin saying things they absolutely should not have said in front of Egypt's queen. Historically, this tends to happen around the fifth cup of wine. Mark Antony leaned back against embroidered cushions while servants refilled his goblet yet again. His face had grown flushed from drink, though Antony wore intoxication comfortably. He was a soldier who could apparently survive battles, political scandals, and quantities of alcohol that might have permanently disabled a lesser aristocrat. Beside him, Cleopatra remained perfectly composed. That alone was impressive. Around them, dancers entered the hall accompanied by flutes and drums. Their performances blended Egyptian and Greek traditions together in carefully crafted spectacles designed to overwhelm Roman guests with the wealth and sophistication of Alexandria. Silk moved through torchlight. Incense drifted across the room. Somewhere nearby, a servant accidentally dropped a silver platter and looked ready to flee directly into the desert. Cleopatra barely glanced at him. Her attention stayed on Antony, more specifically on what Antony revealed when comfortable. She guided the conversation skillfully, shifting from jokes to politics so naturally that most guests never noticed. One moment they discussed horse racing in Antioch. The next they were discussing military loyalty in the eastern provinces. Cleopatra listened closely while Antony complained openly about rivals in Rome, especially Octavian. The mention of Octavian darkened the mood immediately. Several Roman officers became quieter. Others drank faster. One senator stared intensely into his wine cup, as if hoping not to participate in history tonight. Unfortunate strategy. Antony mocked Octavian openly, calling him weak, cold, and better suited to accounting than warfare. The Roman guests laughed carefully, using the cautious tone of men trying not to die, depending on who eventually won the inevitable civil war. Cleopatra encouraged the conversation with subtle smiles and soft questions. She already understood Rome's greatest weakness. Roman leaders hated one another almost as much as they loved power. And tonight, Antony revealed more with every passing hour. Troop numbers, political alliances, private frustrations, future ambitions in the East, all delivered freely between bites of roasted lamb and imported figs, while musicians played peacefully in the background. To outsiders, the evening appeared luxurious and glamorous. In reality, it was one of the most expensive intelligence operations in the ancient world, with significantly better wine. By midnight, the formal banquet had dissolved into something far stranger. Mark Antony had abandoned most remaining Roman dignity. Somewhere between his seventh cup of wine and a loud argument about whether Egyptian musicians played too many flutes around him, generals lounged across couches, while servants continuously replaced empty platters with fresh food, as if the palace kitchens had declared war against hunger itself. Meanwhile, Cleopatra watched everything with calm amusement. This was precisely the atmosphere she wanted. Antony and Cleopatra had become famous throughout Alexandria for their extravagant private circle known as the Society of Inedible Livers. It was less an official organization and more a highly organized campaign against moderation. Members hosted absurd feasts, staged elaborate pranks, wandered the city disguised as common people, and spent alarming quantities of money, proving they were the most entertaining people alive, which admittedly they probably were. Unfortunately for Egypt's treasury, tonight Antony seemed determined to perform for the room. He laughed loudly, slapped soldiers on the shoulder hard enough to nearly dislocate them, and told exaggerated stories about military campaigns in Gaul and Parthia. With every retelling, enemy armies became larger, weather conditions became worse, and Antony himself became increasingly heroic. Roman officers nodded politely. They had heard these stories before. Several times, Cleopatra occasionally interrupted with sharp little jokes that made the entire table laugh, usually at Antony's expense. Unlike many rulers, she understood that humor could control a room faster than threats. Antony adored this about her. She challenged him openly, instead of behaving like a frightened court ornament. At one point, servants carried in a gigantic roasted boar decorated with figs and herbs. The spectacle drew applause from the guests, while musicians intensified their playing nearby. One extremely drunk Roman attempted to compliment the chef in Greek, and accidentally insulted someone's grandmother instead. Diplomatic tensions briefly increased. Outside the palace walls, Alexandria continued buzzing beneath the warm night air, but inside the atmosphere grew almost unreal. Gold cups overflowed, perfume mixed with incense, dancers spun through torchlight, while philosophers, officers, merchants, and nobles all blended together in a haze of luxury and political calculation. Yet beneath the entertainment, Cleopatra continued studying Antony carefully. She saw his strengths clearly, his charisma, his courage, his ability to inspire loyalty. But she also saw the weakness beneath all of it. Antony needed admiration almost as badly as he needed victory, and Rome unfortunately was full of men eager to weaponize both against him. As the larger banquet drifted deeper into drunken chaos, Cleopatra quietly changed the atmosphere of the evening. With a subtle gesture, musicians softened their playing. Several guests were redirected towards side chambers filled with gambling, dancing, and enough wine to erase basic memory formation. Roman officers eagerly disappeared into these distractions with the speed of men professionally trained to make poor late-night decisions. Soon, only a smaller circle remained near the royal table, and eventually, only Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The servants lowered more lamps around the chamber, casting the room in warm golden light. Outside the open balconies, the distant harbor of Alexandria shimmered beneath the night sky. Waves rolled softly against the docks, while the great lighthouse burned in the distance like an enormous star paid for by taxes. Antony reclined comfortably beside Cleopatra, visibly relaxed now that the formal performance of politics had faded. He removed part of his ceremonial cloak and laughed quietly at some forgotten joke from earlier in the evening. For the first time that night, he looked tired. Not weak, just exhausted. Years of civil war had carved themselves into him. Endless campaigning, betrayals, negotiations, Senate arguments, shifting alliances. Rome consumed its leaders the way fire consumes dry wood constantly, loudly, usually while somebody nearby shouted about honor. Cleopatra studied him carefully. Unlike many Roman aristocrats, Antony still possessed warmth. He could laugh with soldiers, drink with common men, and speak emotionally without sounding embarrassed by the existence of human feelings. That made him dangerous politically, but deeply attractive personally. Octavian, by comparison, was colder, more controlled, and infinitely more patient. Cleopatra understood this better than Antony did. Their conversation shifted into quieter territory. They spoke about the eastern provinces, about future campaigns, about Rome's growing instability. Antony described his frustrations with the Senate, while Cleopatra listened beside half-empty wine cups and extinguished candles. Then came the real subject beneath everything else: power. Antony needed Egypt's money, ships, and political support for the conflicts ahead. Cleopatra needed Antony because Rome's protection remained essential for Egypt's survival. Both understood the arrangement perfectly, yet somewhere between strategy and attraction, the boundaries had become blurred, dangerously blurred. Cleopatra reached for a cluster of grapes resting beside a silver plate and smiled faintly as Antony continued speaking about future victories in the East. He spoke confidently about destiny, conquest, and glory. Like many Roman generals before disaster, outside, Alexandria slept beneath the warm Mediterranean night. Inside the palace, two of the most powerful people in the ancient world quietly planned a future that would eventually terrify Rome itself. By the time dawn began creeping across the harbor of Alexandria, the palace looked like the aftermath of a very elegant battlefield. Empty wine cups covered the tables. Melted candle wax hardened across silver trays. Half-finished platters of figs, bread, and roasted meat sat abandoned beneath drifting clouds of incense. A Roman officer snored loudly near a column, while two exhausted servants debated whether it was morally acceptable to leave him there permanently. Historically, palace staff often reached this emotional stage around sunrise. Mark Antony awoke later than intended. The Roman general sat slowly upright inside a luxurious chamber overlooking the sea, blinking against the morning light pouring through linen curtains. Somewhere nearby, fountains trickled softly while distant voices echoed through the palace corridors. Antony pressed a hand against his forehead. The wine from the previous night had apparently declared war on his skull sometime before dawn. Still, despite the headache, he smiled faintly, because Alexandria offered something Rome no longer did: peace, or at least the illusion of it. In Rome, every meal felt like a negotiation. Every friendship carried suspicion. Every senator secretly imagined himself becoming either dictator or martyr, usually both. But here in Egypt, Antony could almost forget the endless political knives waiting for him across the sea. Almost. A servant entered quietly, carrying watered wine, bread, olives, and fresh fruit for breakfast. Antony accepted it gratefully while asking whether Cleopatra was awake. The servant hesitated slightly. She has already begun meeting with advisors, he explained carefully. Of course she had. While half the palace recovered from catastrophic wine decisions, Cleopatra was already working. In another wing of the palace, the queen sat beside open scrolls and maps, while Egyptian officials discussed grain shipments, taxation, naval activity, and reports from eastern territories. Cleopatra listened closely, asking precise questions while scribes recorded every detail. Unlike Antony, she never truly relaxed. Rulers who survived long in the ancient world rarely did, especially female rulers surrounded by ambitious men. When Antony finally joined her later that morning, Cleopatra greeted him warmly, but with visible amusement at his condition. She offered him diluted wine and calmly continued discussing politics, while Antony slowly attempted to recover his ability to exist upright. Together, they reviewed military concerns in the east, trade routes through the Mediterranean, and growing tensions with Octavian back in Rome. The feast was over. Now came the consequences. And somewhere far away in Italy, Octavian was already preparing his own version of dinner conversation. His simply involved fewer musicians and significantly more future executions. Far from the warm halls of Alexandria, the city of Rome was already feeding itself on rumors. And Rome loved rumors almost as much as it loved public executions. Merchants arriving from the east carried stories about Mark Antony living like a foreign king beside Cleopatra. Sailors exaggerated the luxury of the Egyptian court until it sounded less like a palace and more like a mythical paradise constructed entirely from gold, perfume, and catastrophic financial decisions. According to gossip, Antony spent his nights drinking with Cleopatra on jeweled barges drifting across the Nile while servants scattered flower petals into the water. Some claimed he wore Eastern clothing now. Others insisted he had abandoned Roman discipline entirely. One particularly dramatic senator even claimed Antony planned to move the center of Roman power to Alexandria, which was nonsense, but effective nonsense. Inside the Senate, these stories spread rapidly through marble corridors already thick with paranoia and ambition. Roman politicians whispered constantly about Antony's growing attachment to Egypt. Many feared Cleopatra's influence. Others simply hated the idea of a Roman general appearing happy anywhere outside Italy. At the center of this political storm stood Octavian. Unlike Antony, Octavian rarely wasted energy on loud emotions. He observed quietly, listened carefully, and weaponized information with the patience of a man slowly sharpening a knife in another room. While everyone else argued downstairs and Antony was giving him endless material, Octavian understood Rome perfectly. Roman citizens tolerated violence, corruption, and occasional massacres with remarkable flexibility, but they deeply distrusted kings. The memory of Rome's old monarchy still haunted the Republic centuries later. Now, Antony appeared beside an Eastern queen surrounded by unimaginable wealth and foreign customs. Politically, it was a disaster waiting patiently to happen. Back in Alexandria, Antony remained largely unconcerned. He spent days attending military meetings and evenings with Cleopatra, enjoying the city's luxury while planning future Eastern campaigns, public festivals, private banquets, hunts, river excursions. Life around the Egyptian court continued with dazzling extravagance. Cleopatra likely understood the danger better than Antony did. She knew Rome feared powerful women, especially foreign queens. Roman writers already described her as seductive, manipulative, and dangerous, which, to be fair, she absolutely was. Ancient rulers generally did not survive by being emotionally delicate gardeners. Still, Antony ignored many warnings. He believed military success would protect him politically. But Rome was changing. Victory alone no longer guaranteed survival. And while Antony drank beneath Egyptian torchlight, Octavian quietly built something far more dangerous back in Rome: a narrative. The great ceremony in Alexandria was designed to impress the world. Unfortunately, it also terrified Rome. Massive crowds gathered outside the royal gymnasium, while musicians played through the streets and incense drifted into the warm Mediterranean air. Gold banners hung from marble buildings. Soldiers lined the processional roads. Merchants abandoned their stalls just to witness the spectacle unfolding before them. At the center of it all sat Cleopatra and Mark Antony, upon enormous golden thrones raised high above the crowd. Subtlety had officially died. Beside them stood Cleopatra's children, dressed in royal clothing, heavy with jewels and embroidered silk. The scene blended Egyptian tradition, Greek theater, and Roman political recklessness into one astonishing public display. Antony announced the so-called donations of Alexandria. Territories across the eastern Mediterranean were symbolically distributed among Cleopatra and her children. Lands not fully conquered yet were included as well, which was an extremely optimistic administrative strategy. One child received Armenia, another received Cyrene, another was proclaimed ruler of territories stretching toward Parthia, and Cleopatra herself was publicly declared Queen of Kings. The crowd erupted into celebration. Musicians played louder. Priests raised ceremonial objects toward the sky. Citizens cheered as coins were thrown into the streets. To the people of Alexandria, the ceremony represented Egypt standing proudly beside Rome as an equal power once again. To Rome, however, it looked horrifying because from a Roman perspective, Antony appeared less like a republican general and more like an Eastern monarch intoxicated by luxury and foreign influence. The image of a Roman leader sitting beside Cleopatra on golden thrones spread rapidly across the Mediterranean, and Octavian immediately seized upon it. Back in Rome, Octavian presented Antony's actions as betrayal. He claimed Antony had abandoned Roman values, surrendered himself to Cleopatra, and intended to hand Roman territories over to foreign rulers. The Senate reacted with outrage. Roman citizens muttered angrily in markets and forums. Veterans questioned Antony's loyalty. Senators who already disliked him now possessed the perfect political weapon. Cleopatra had become the symbol of everything Rome feared: foreign luxury, female power, Eastern influence, and Antony stood beside her willingly. In Alexandria, the celebrations continued long into the night with more feasting, more wine, and more theatrical displays of wealth. Antony likely believed he was securing a glorious Eastern future. Instead, he had handed Octavian exactly what he needed: a villain for Rome. And historically, Rome tended to solve political disagreements with alarming amounts of blood. The final great dinners between Cleopatra and Mark Antony carried a different atmosphere now. The laughter remained. The wine still flowed endlessly. Musicians continued playing beneath torchlight, while servants carried roasted meats, figs, oysters, honey cakes, and silver bowls overflowing with imported spices. But underneath the luxury, everyone could feel it. War was coming inside the palace of Alexandria. Generals and advisors moved through corridors with growing urgency. Messengers arrived daily from across the Mediterranean, bringing reports about troop movements, naval preparations, and speeches made by Octavian back in Rome. Octavian had turned public opinion against Antony masterfully. Officially, Rome was not preparing for war against Antony himself. That would have been politically complicated. Instead, Octavian framed the conflict as a war against Cleopatra, against Egypt, against foreign corruption supposedly poisoning Rome from the east. It was brilliant propaganda because it allowed Roman citizens to imagine they were defending the Republic rather than participating in yet another civil war, which was convenient. Romans had become slightly exhausted by endless civil wars at this point. During one dinner, Antony reportedly mocked Octavian openly before his officers, dismissing him as weak and cowardly. The room laughed dutifully. Though several commanders looked nervous while drinking their wine, Cleopatra noticed. She always noticed. Unlike Antony, she understood that Octavian's strength did not come from charisma or military brilliance. It came from patience, discipline, and control. He rarely drank excessively, rarely lost emotional control, rarely revealed more than necessary, which made him deeply dangerous. Still, Antony refused to retreat from the path ahead. Pride, love, ambition, and years of rivalry with Octavian had carried events too far now. Fleets were already gathering. Soldiers were already marching. The great confrontation was unavoidable. That evening, Cleopatra hosted another magnificent feast overlooking the harbor. Golden lamps reflected against dark theater, while music echoed across palace balconies. For a few hours, the royal court pretended the future did not exist. Guests drank heavily. Officers laughed loudly. Dancers performed beneath the stars. Yet somewhere beyond the music, everyone understood the truth. Many of the men sitting at these tables would soon be dead. And the relationship that began with lavish dinners and political flirtation would eventually end beside the sea at Battle of Actium, where Rome's future would be decided forever. A surprisingly dramatic outcome for what had originally started as dinner conversation with too much wine. The royal city of Persepolis rose from the Persian landscape like a warning carved into stone. Massive staircases climbed toward palaces supported by towering columns taller than most trees. Relief carvings covered the walls, showing delegations from across the empire bringing tribute to the great king. Gold from Lydia, ivory from Nubia, textiles from Babylon, horses from Central Asia. Every surface existed for one purpose: to remind visitors that the Persian Empire was enormous, wealthy, and absolutely not interested in appearing modest about it. Tonight, however, Thessaly prepared for celebration rather than ceremony. A noble wedding feast was about to begin. Servants hurried across the palace terraces carrying baskets of figs, almonds, pistachios, dates, and fresh pomegranates split open like jewels beneath the evening light. In the lower kitchens, cooks rotated whole lambs over enormous fires, while others prepared flatbread, yogurt sauces, honey cakes, and stews filled with herbs and saffron. Smoke drifted upward into the warm air, carrying the smell of roasted meat and spices across the royal complex. Nearby, musicians tuned long-necked lutes, drums, and reed flutes, while dancers prepared themselves inside torchlit chambers. Noble guests had already begun arriving through the great gates, wearing embroidered robes dyed in deep reds, blues, and golds. Jewelry glittered beneath the fading sunlight. Perfume filled the air, and everywhere servants moved carefully through the crowd, trying not to spill wine onto people important enough to legally ruin their lives. The wedding itself was not merely a family affair. Nothing among the Persian elite ever truly was. Marriage inside the empire often carried political meaning. Noble houses strengthened alliances through ceremonies like this one. Powerful families measured influence through guest lists, gifts, and seating arrangements with the seriousness of military strategy. A place beside the wrong noble could quietly insult an entire bloodline for generations. Ancient aristocrats were astonishingly sensitive people. At the center of the great banquet hall stood long rows of low tables surrounded by luxurious carpets and cushions. Golden lamps flickered between the columns while enormous bronze braziers filled the chamber with warmth. Above everything towered the carved stone pillars of Persepolis itself, making every guest feel slightly smaller beneath the weight of imperial power. As night settled over the city, the feast finally began. Wine flowed immediately, which historically was both predictable and concerning. Because once Persian nobles started drinking, conversations about poetry, politics, marriage alliances, and military campaigns tended to blend together very quickly. And tonight, beneath the towering halls of Persepolis, hundreds of powerful guests prepared to eat, drink, negotiate, celebrate, and quietly judge one another for the next several hours. As darkness settled over Persepolis, the royal terraces filled with torchlight and arriving guests. Noble families entered the palace complex in slow processions beneath towering stone gateways guarded by carvings of bulls and mythical creatures. Sandaled servants carried lanterns ahead of them, while others followed behind with gifts wrapped in embroidered cloth, silver drinking bowls, carved ivory boxes, bolts of dyed linen, perfumes from Egypt, and jewelry heavy enough to permanently damage the posture of whoever wore it. Persian aristocrats believed celebration should appear magnificent, preferably exhausting as well. Inside the great hall, musicians began playing soft melodies on harps and reed flutes, while servants poured wine into golden cups almost immediately upon arrival. Guests reclined across luxurious carpets and cushions, arranged carefully according to status. The closer someone sat to the central tables, the more politically important they usually were, and everyone noticed where everyone else was seated. A misplaced cushion could create resentment lasting longer than some wars. The groom's family occupied one side of the hall, dressed in flowing robes stitched with gold thread and intricate patterns. The bride's relatives sat opposite them, surrounded by trays of fruit, flowers, and ceremonial gifts. Between them stretched the vast banquet chamber itself, lit by bronze fire basins that cast warm light upward onto the massive stone columns supporting the roof high above. The scale of Persepolis impressed nearly everyone who entered it. That was intentional. The Achaemenid kings had designed the city specifically to overwhelm visitors from across the empire. Delegations from conquered territories would walk through these halls surrounded by unimaginable wealth before meeting the Persian court. It was architecture functioning as psychological warfare. Very elegant psychological warfare. As more guests arrived, conversations spread across the room in dozens of languages and accents from every region of the empire. Persian nobles discussed military campaigns and taxes, while merchants negotiated trade opportunities between bites of roasted lamb. Somewhere nearby, two older aristocrats argued politely about horses with the intensity of men debating the fate of civilization itself. Meanwhile, servants continued carrying endless food into the hall, platters of grilled birds glazed with honey, bowls of herbs and soft cheeses, dates stuffed with crushed nuts, rice mixed with saffron and dried fruit. The smell alone probably added several years to everyone's life expectancy. At the center of the celebration, the bride and groom remained mostly composed, while priests prepared the marriage rituals nearby. The young couple exchanged careful smiles beneath layers of jewelry and ceremonial clothing, fully aware that hundreds of wealthy strangers were currently analyzing their posture, behavior, and family alliances in real time. Ancient weddings were surprisingly stressful, especially when half the empire's elite attended dinner afterward. As the feast continued beneath the towering halls of Persepolis, servants slowly cleared the central space of the banquet chamber. Musicians softened their playing while priests dressed in flowing white robes stepped forward carrying small ceremonial objects, bowls of incense, and sacred fire lamps whose flames flickered against the stone columns high above. The marriage rituals were about to begin. Conversation across the hall quieted gradually, though several nobles continued whispering about politics, even during the sacred ceremony. Ancient aristocrats possessed an extraordinary ability to turn literally any event into networking. The bride entered first. Gold jewelry shimmered around her neck and wrists, while embroidered fabrics trailed softly behind her across the carpets. Her hair had been perfumed with oils and carefully braided with decorative threads and tiny ornaments that reflected the torchlight. Behind her walked female relatives carrying flowers, fruit, and ceremonial gifts. Moments later, the groom approached from the opposite side of the hall, accompanied by male members of his family and several armed retainers, not because violence was expected during the wedding mostly, but because Persian nobles rarely traveled anywhere unarmed. Trust was admired philosophically, but approached cautiously in practice. At the center of the chamber stood a ceremonial table covered with bread, herbs, wine, fruits, and bowls of spices representing prosperity and abundance. Sacred flames burned nearby, while priests recited blessings in ancient ritual language that echoed softly through the enormous hall. The atmosphere changed completely now. The loud conversations faded. Musicians played gently in the background. Even the servants moved more carefully, as though the palace itself had become aware that something important was unfolding beneath its massive stone ceilings. The couple sat facing one another while family elders offered blessings and symbolic gifts. Wine was shared, bread was broken, relatives exchanged formal words about loyalty, prosperity, and the joining of noble houses. And somewhere in the back of the room, one elderly aristocrat had already consumed enough wine to begin crying emotionally into a plate of dates, despite not being closely related to either family. Ancient feasts were deeply emotional places, especially after several hours of drinking. Outside the palace terraces, cool desert air moved through Persepolis, while distant torches flickered across the royal complex. But inside the hall, warmth from the braziers and crowded guests filled the chamber with life, smoke, perfume, and the constant smell of roasted meat still arriving from the kitchens. Once the formal rituals ended, applause and music erupted across the hall once more. The serious part of the evening was complete. Now came the dangerous phase. The drinking would intensify. Once the formal marriage rituals ended, the atmosphere inside Persepolis changed instantly. The musicians played louder. Drums echoed between the massive stone columns, while flutes and stringed instruments filled the banquet hall with fast, lively melodies. Servants moved quickly through the crowd, carrying fresh wine pitchers, as though the empire itself might collapse if anyone's cup remained empty for too long, which, politically speaking, may actually have been a concern. The bride and groom were escorted toward the central dining area, while guests applauded and raised golden cups in celebration. Dancers entered the hall moments later, dressed in flowing garments stitched with beads and bright embroidered patterns that shimmered beneath the firelight. The feast truly began now. Platters of roasted lamb covered in herbs were carried into the hall alongside grilled birds glazed with honey and pomegranate syrup. Bowls of pistachios, walnuts, figs, dates, and soft cheeses filled the low tables. Flatbreads, still warm from the ovens, were stacked high beside silver dishes of yogurt mixed with mint and garlic. The smell drifting through the chamber was powerful enough to briefly unite every noble house in the empire, at least until politics returned, and politics always returned. Groups of aristocrats reclined across carpets discussing military campaigns near Egypt, trade routes through Babylon, and rumors surrounding the royal court. Some spoke quietly about taxation. Others discussed succession struggles inside distant provinces. One particularly loud noble spent nearly 20 minutes explaining horse breeding techniques to guests who clearly regretted sitting near him. Wine continued flowing relentlessly. Persian banquets often involved heavy drinking among the elite, though many nobles prided themselves on remaining composed while intoxicated. This ambition succeeded with mixed results. One elderly governor became emotional during a song about ancient kings and attempted to embrace 3 different people consecutively before realizing 2 of them were servants carrying soup. Meanwhile, younger nobles competed through poetry recitations, hunting stories, and displays of wealth, so excessive they bordered on architectural achievements. Rings glittered beneath torchlight, gold-threaded robes draped across cushions, perfume mixed with smoke from the braziers filling the hall with warmth and haze. At the center of the celebration, musicians and dancers performed continuously beneath the towering columns of Persepolis, while the newly married couple accepted blessings and gifts from noble guests. But beneath the music and celebration, careful observation never stopped. Every conversation mattered. Every alliance mattered. Every marriage inside the Persian elite strengthened someone politically, while quietly threatening someone else, which meant even this magnificent wedding feast was not simply about love. It was also about power. Ancient empires rarely separated the two. As the night deepened inside Persepolis, the banquet hall grew warmer, louder, and significantly less dignified. Thousands of oil lamps flickered against the towering columns, while servants hurried endlessly between the tables, carrying fresh trays of food and heavy bronze pitchers of wine. Music echoed through the palace with constant drums, flutes, and stringed instruments blending together beneath the haze of smoke and perfume. The feast had now reached its most dangerous stage. Everyone was comfortable. Persian nobles reclined across carpets and cushions in loose circles, eating with their hands from shared platters while discussing politics, military campaigns, and family alliances between long drinks of wine. Some guests had removed their heavier ceremonial robes due to the heat inside the crowded hall. Others continued drinking with determined professionalism, despite clearly approaching complete conversational collapse. One governor from Media had begun repeating the same hunting story for the third time. No one stopped him, mostly because he controlled important trade routes. At the center tables, the newly married couple received gifts from powerful guests across the empire. Gold bracelets, silver cups, decorated daggers, fine horses promised through elaborate speeches. One noble even offered a shipment of cedarwood from distant lands with the dramatic seriousness of a man presenting military reinforcements instead of construction materials. Nearby, servants sliced roasted lamb directly from enormous spits, while cooks carried steaming bowls of saffron rice mixed with raisins, nuts, and herbs into the hall. Pomegranates sat piled beside honey cakes glazed with syrup. Fresh bread continued arriving constantly, as though the kitchens feared rebellion if carbohydrates disappeared for even a moment, which, considering aristocrats, was not impossible. Meanwhile, musicians intensified the atmosphere further. Dances spun through the open spaces between the columns, while guests clapped along to the rhythm of drums echoing through the massive chamber. The sound bounced against stone walls carved with scenes of kings, warriors, and tribute bearers from every corner of the empire. Above the celebration towered Persepolis itself, immense, silent, watching, and beneath all the luxury, quieter conversations continued carefully in the corners of the hall. Military commanders discussed unrest near imperial borders. Merchants negotiated future trade partnerships. Noble families quietly evaluated potential marriage alliances for younger relatives seated nearby, pretending not to notice, because this was how power worked in the ancient Persian world. Not only through war or royal decrees, but through dinners, feasts, weddings, shared wine beneath palace columns. By midnight, several alliances had likely been strengthened, 2 trade agreements informally arranged, and at least one future political rivalry accidentally created over seating arrangements and excessive drinking. A remarkably efficient evening, historically speaking. By the later hours of the feast, the atmosphere inside Persepolis had shifted from formal celebration into something far more chaotic and human. The music continued, though less elegantly now. Drummers played louder. Flute players improvised wildly. One musician appeared to be performing with genuine spiritual intensity, while another looked as though he had forgotten where he was sometime around his 8th cup of wine. The nobles, meanwhile, had entered the storytelling phase of the evening. This was inevitable. Ancient aristocrats loved telling stories about war, hunting, politics, and personal bravery, usually exaggerated, often impossible, occasionally involving lions that behaved suspiciously like confused farm animals. Near one of the central fire basins, an older Persian commander described campaigns fought under Darius the Great decades earlier. He spoke of endless deserts, mountain passes, rebellious provinces, and battles fought beneath burning sun and freezing night winds. With every retelling, enemy armies grew larger, naturally. Nearby, younger nobles listened carefully, while pretending not to notice that the old commander had already forgotten parts of his own chronology. At one point, he accidentally described the same battle twice from opposite directions. No one corrected him. The man still controlled troops. At another table, wealthy merchants discussed trade caravans crossing the empire from India to the Mediterranean. They spoke about ivory, spices, lapis, lazuli, silk, horses, and gold moving across roads protected by Persian authority. The empire stretched so far that many guests inside this hall would never see most of the lands technically ruled by their king. And yet, tribute from those distant territories surrounded them tonight in the form of food, wine, fabrics, perfumes, and decoration. That was the true purpose of Persepolis, to display imperial power physically. Even the wedding feast reflected this. Nobles from dozens of regions reclined together beneath one roof, speaking different languages while eating food gathered from across the empire. The Persians understood symbolism extremely well, especially expensive symbolism. At the center of the hall, the bride and groom now appeared more relaxed as laughter, and drinking loosened the rigid formality of the earlier ceremonies. Friends toasted their future. Relatives exchanged blessings. Servants continued refilling cups with frightening efficiency. Outside, cool night air drifted across the palace terraces beneath a sky filled with stars over ancient Persia. Inside, the feast carried on beneath the towering columns, while stories of kings, wars, loyalty, and empire echoed through the hall long into the night. Because in Persepolis, even a wedding became a reminder of imperial greatness, and also of humanity's ancient inability to stop talking after drinking wine. By midnight, the wedding feast inside Persepolis had become almost dreamlike. The towering stone columns disappeared upward into darkness beyond the torchlight, while hundreds of oil lamps flickered across the enormous hall. Smoke from braziers curled slowly toward the ceiling, carrying the smell of roasted lamb, incense, wine, and warm bread through the crowded chamber. The musicians had not stopped playing 4 hours. Neither, apparently, had the nobles stopped drinking. Groups of aristocrats reclined across carpets and varying stages of dignity and collapse. Some debated politics with intense seriousness while struggling to remain physically upright. Others laughed loudly at jokes that had likely stopped being funny several cups ago. One elderly nobleman attempted to recite poetry while holding an entire pomegranate, like a philosophical object of great importance. The audience applauded politely, mostly out of fear. At the central tables, servants carried fresh platters into the hall continuously. Honey-glazed birds, bowls of pistachios and almonds, dates soaked in syrup, soft cheeses dusted with herbs, and endless cuts of roasted meat sliced directly onto silver trays. The Persian elite believed hospitality reflected power, and tonight, the empire appeared powerful enough to feed several armies simultaneously. The bride and groom now sat more comfortably among close relatives, while dancers performed nearby beneath rhythmic drums and reed flutes. Jewelry shimmered in the firelight. Wine spilled occasionally across carpets, worth more than entire villages. Servants cleaned it immediately with the speed of people very interested in surviving the evening. Beyond the feast itself, quieter meetings unfolded in the corners of the hall. Military officers discussed unrest near the empire's borders. Satraps negotiated taxation agreements. Merchants quietly arranged future trade partnerships, stretching across thousands of miles. Because Persian feasts were never only celebrations. They were political theaters. Every guest observed everyone else carefully. Which family appeared wealthiest? Which governor seemed favored at court? Which alliances were strengthening? Which rivalries looked ready to explode into future problems involving armies and strongly worded royal messages? At one side of the hall, a group of nobles spoke quietly about Xerxes the Men and the empire's wars against the Greeks years earlier. Some blamed failed campaigns on poor generals. Others blamed arrogance. One man blamed the sea itself for refusing to cooperate with Persian engineering. Historically, rulers have often argued with oceans. The oceans remain undefeated. Outside the palace, Persepolis rested beneath cold stars and silent mountains. But inside the great halls, music, laughter, politics, and celebration continued deep into the night beneath columns built to outlive everyone present. And in many ways they did. As the night stretched toward dawn, the great wedding feast inside Persepolis slowly began to change, not quieter. Persian noble feasts rarely became quiet, but softer somehow, more exhausted. The sharp energy of the earlier celebration faded into long conversations, slower music, and the heavy comfort of people who had eaten and drunk far beyond reasonable human limits. The enormous banquet hall glowed beneath dying torchlight. Oil lamps flickered weakly against the towering columns, while servants replaced burnt-out flames one by one. The air had grown thick with smoke, incense, spilled wine, and the lingering scent of roasted lamb still drifting from the kitchens. Across the carpets and cushions, nobles reclined in scattered groups, speaking more honestly now than they probably intended. Wine had reached the dangerous truth-telling stage. A satrap from Babylon quietly complained about taxes demanded by the royal administration. A military officer admitted concern about unrest in distant provinces. Merchants discussed caravan raids along eastern trade roads while pretending not to blame. Local governors sitting nearby. Ancient diplomacy often looked remarkably similar to exhausted gossip at 2 a.m. At the center tables, the bride and groom received final blessings from elderly relatives whose speeches had become increasingly emotional with every passing cup of wine. One elderly aunt cried openly, while holding both of their hands and repeating the same blessing 3 separate times. No one interrupted her. mostly because everyone feared she might start over from the beginning. Nearby, musicians played slower melodies now. Flutes echoed gently through the hall, while dancers moved with less intensity than earlier in the night. Even the drummers appeared tired. One servant carrying wine nearly walked directly into a column carved centuries earlier, with scenes of royal triumph. The column survived heroically. Outside the palace terraces, cool desert winds swept across the royal city while stars shimmered above ancient Persia. The vast empire slept beyond Persepolis, distant provinces, mountain fortresses, caravan roads, river cities, all connected through the authority represented inside these halls tonight. That was the purpose behind ceremonies like this. The wedding was not only about two individuals. It was about stability, power, alliance, the continuation of noble bloodlines beneath the protection of the empire itself. And as the feast finally began winding toward its final hours, servants quietly started clearing empty platters and overturned cups from the carpets, while guests prepared either for sleep or for continuing the celebration somewhere significantly less ceremonial. Historically, aristocrats have always struggled with the concept of the evening is over, especially wealthy aristocrats with unlimited wine. The final hours of the wedding feast arrived quietly, not because the celebration inside Persepolis had suddenly become calm. That would have required several hundred nobles to rediscover moderation simultaneously, which historically almost never happens. But exhaustion had finally begun defeating even the wine. The great banquet hall looked transformed now. Empty cups and abandoned platters covered the low tables. Half-melted candles flickered weakly beside overturned bowls of pistachios and crushed pomegranate skins staining expensive carpets. Musicians played softer melodies near the far columns, while exhausted servants moved carefully through the hall, collecting dishes and helping heavily intoxicated guests locate either their rooms or basic physical balance. Outside, the first pale light of dawn slowly touched the stone terraces of Persepolis. Cold morning air drifted through the palace corridors, carrying silence from the surrounding mountains. The stars above ancient Persia faded gradually, while the enormous columns of the royal complex emerged once more from the darkness, and beneath them, the final conversations of the feast continued. Some nobles remained awake, discussing politics in hushed voices after entire nights of drinking. Military commanders quietly debated future campaigns and border troubles, while merchants negotiated caravan contracts beside nearly empty wine pitches. Because even after hours of music, dancing, and celebration, the empire never truly slept. At the center of the hall, the bride and groom sat together, surrounded by close family members and fading torchlight. Their ceremonial clothing now looked slightly disordered after the endless hours of greetings, blessings, and public attention. Yet the atmosphere around them had softened. The formal pressure of the earlier rituals was gone. Now remained only fatigue, relief, and the strange stillness that follows enormous celebrations. Nearby, elderly relatives finally drifted towards sleep on cushions beside the walls, while younger nobles continued laughing somewhere deeper in the palace complex. One highly intoxicated aristocrat attempted to continue a philosophical argument with a servant who clearly regretted every decision leading to this interaction. The servant eventually escaped, a rare victory for the working class. As sunlight slowly entered the banquet hall, the immense carvings and reliefs of Persepolis became visible again across the walls. Kings receiving tribute, soldiers marching in endless processions, nobles bringing gifts from distant lands. The empire watched itself in stone, and for one long night beneath those towering columns, its elite had celebrated marriage, power, wealth, alliance, and continuity through food, wine, music, and spectacle. But like all feasts, even this one ended. The fires would cool, the guests would depart, the music would stop. Yet Persepolis itself would remain standing above the Persian plain, long after every voice in this hall had disappeared into history. The camp along the frozen banks of the Mississippi River did not look particularly heroic. Mud covered nearly everything. Smoke drifted from rough log cabins into the cold winter air. Soldiers cursed while dragging barrels through slush. Dogs barked constantly. Somewhere near the shoreline, a man slipped carrying supplies and disappeared briefly into freezing water, immediately becoming the least respected member of the expedition for the next several days. This was Camp Dubois in the winter of 1803. And from this miserable patch of mud and timber, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark prepared to lead one of the most ambitious journeys in American history. The recently completed Louisiana Purchase had doubled the size of the United States almost overnight. President Thomas Jefferson wanted answers about the enormous western territories, now technically belonging to the young republic. What rivers existed there? Which native nations controlled the land? Could Americans reach the Pacific Ocean through a navigable water route? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly had the United States just bought from France? Besides endless wilderness and future arguments, Lewis and Clark spent months preparing carefully at Camp Dubois near St. Louis. The core of discovery included soldiers, hunters, interpreters, laborers, and frontiersmen selected for endurance and survival skills. These men would face rivers, storms, disease, isolation, hunger, unfamiliar terrain, and animals large enough to reconsider a man's confidence in firearms entirely, especially grizzly bears. The expedition supplies reflected the scale of the challenge ahead: gunpowder, rifles, medical instruments, axes, rope, trade goods for native tribes, scientific equipment for mapping and astronomy, dried meat, flour, salt pork, and portable soup packed into barrels and crates that seemed to multiply endlessly across the camp. At the riverbank sat the expedition's largest vessel, a massive keelboat nearly 55 feet long, built specifically for the journey upriver. The boat looked sturdy enough from a distance. Closer inspection inspired less confidence. Men spent entire days repairing leaks, organizing cargo, and practicing rowing against powerful currents. While Clark enforced discipline throughout the camp, Lewis handled scientific preparations and correspondence, while also worrying constantly about details. And there were many details to worry about. Beyond the camp stretched lands few Americans had ever mapped accurately. Vast plains, enormous rivers, mountain ranges, and native nations unknown to most Eastern citizens waited beyond the horizon. At night, campfires flickered across the muddy settlement, while soldiers spoke quietly about the journey ahead. Some felt excitement, others felt dread. Most wisely felt both, because once the expedition departed upriver in the spring, there would be no easy return, only wilderness stretching westward into the unknown. As spring approached at Camp Dubois, the entire expedition revolved around one enormous problem: the boat. More specifically, how to feed an absurd quantity of supplies, weapons, tools, scientific equipment, food, trade goods, and human beings into a single keelboat without immediately sinking into the Mississippi River like a floating warehouse of bad decisions. The massive vessel rested along the muddy shoreline, while men loaded barrels and crates beneath cold morning rain and endless clouds of mosquitoes. Nearly every object needed for survival in the western wilderness had to be packed carefully before departure, and they packed everything: gunpowder sealed in lead containers, axes and blacksmith tools, spare rifles, medical supplies, flour, salt pork, dried peas, and portable suit bricks, hard enough to qualify as construction material. There were even gifts for native tribes: mirrors, beads, tobacco, knives, and medals bearing the face of Thomas Jefferson. Because diplomacy in the early American frontier often involved handing strangers shiny objects and hoping nobody started shooting, William Clark supervised much of the physical preparation. He organized supplies with military precision while drilling the men repeatedly in rowing and boat handling. Clark understood the rivers ahead would be dangerous enough without adding confusion and incompetence into the situation voluntarily. Meanwhile, Meriwether Lewis focused heavily on scientific preparations. He checked navigation instruments constantly, worried over maps, recorded notes, and studied medicine learned under physician Benjamin Rush. Lewis also carried an experimental air rifle capable of firing repeatedly without reloading powder. The weapon impressed nearly everyone who saw it, mostly because nothing says peaceful diplomatic mission quite like demonstrating advanced rapid-fire technology to people who have never seen compressed air weapons before. Around camp, the men settled into harsh routines. They rose before sunrise, repaired equipment, cleaned weapons, practiced rowing, hunted game, and prepared for months of exhausting river travel ahead. Conditions remained rough. Mud covered boots constantly. Clothing stayed damp. Smoke from campfires drifted through the cabins day and night. Yet excitement slowly grew among the core of discovery, because beyond the Mississippi stretched a world most Americans only imagined through rumors and half-finished maps. Vast plains, unknown rivers, mountains no member of the expedition had ever seen, and danger, always danger. At night, soldiers gathered around the fires, discussing stories from trappers and traders who claimed the western wilderness contained endless buffalo herds, violent storms, hostile encounters, and landscapes so enormous they barely seemed real. Some men laughed confidently, others stared quietly into the flames, because once the expedition pushed upriver, civilization itself would begin disappearing behind them mile by mile. In the spring of 1804, the Corps of Discovery finally departed from Camp Dubois and pushed their heavy keelboat into the muddy waters of the Mississippi River. The journey had begun. There were no cheering crowds lining the shoreline, no grand speeches echoing across the riverbanks, mostly just tired men shoving a dangerously overloaded boat into strong currents while trying not to fall into the water in front of their co-workers. History often appears less cinematic up close. The keelboat moved slowly upstream, powered by sails, poles, ropes, and human suffering. Whenever the wind failed, the men rowed. When rowing became impossible against the current, they dragged the vessel forward manually from the shoreline using long ropes. This process was exhausting. The Missouri River, in particular, fought them constantly. Thick brown currents pushed against the boat day and night, while hidden snags and shifting sandbars threatened to destroy the expedition before it had even properly begun. William Clark maintained strict discipline among the men during the difficult travel upriver. Guards rotated regularly, weapons were cleaned daily, supplies were inspected constantly. Clark understood small problems on the frontier could rapidly become deadly ones. Meanwhile, Meriwether Lewis spent much of the journey recording observations about plants, animals, weather patterns, and geography. He carefully documented everything they encountered because much of the territory remained unknown to American science. Every bend in the river represented new information, new risks, as, well, the men passed endless forests, towering bluffs, and isolated stretches of wilderness where signs of permanent American settlement disappeared completely. Occasionally, they encountered traders or small frontier communities along the riverbanks, but these grew increasingly rare as the expedition pushed farther west. At night, the Corps of Discovery established camps along muddy shorelines beneath dark skies, filled with insects and strange animal sounds echoing through the wilderness. Fires crackled while guards remained awake, watching the surrounding darkness carefully. Not all dangers came from wildlife. The expedition understood they would eventually enter territories controlled by numerous native nations, whose reactions to armed American explorers remained uncertain. Lewis and Clark hoped diplomacy and trade would secure peaceful relations. The rifles were there in case optimism failed. Despite the hardships, many men felt growing excitement as civilization slowly faded behind them. The world ahead remained largely unmapped by Americans. Vast rivers stretched westward into territory few Eastern citizens could even imagine properly. And somewhere beyond those rivers lay the Pacific Ocean, at least theoretically. The maps became noticeably less confident about details after that point. By the time the expedition pushed deeper into the Missouri River, the romantic idea of exploration had begun collapsing rapidly. The river was enormous, unpredictable, and apparently offended by their presence personally. The Corps of Discovery spent entire days battling powerful currents beneath brutal summer heat, while mosquitoes descended upon the men with military organization and emotional commitment. The keelboat moved painfully slowly upriver. Some days the expedition covered only a few miles, despite exhausting labor from sunrise until dark. William Clark often stood near the front of the boat, shouting instructions while crews rowed desperately against the current. Other men used long poles to push the heavy vessel forward through shallow sections of river. When sandbars trapped the keelboat, everyone climbed into the water to drag it free manually, which sounded miserable because it absolutely was. Mud covered clothing constantly. Boots rotted from endless moisture. Hands blistered from ropes and us. Several men suffered fevers, while others complained about insects so aggressively that one soldier reportedly claimed mosquitoes could carry away a small child if properly motivated. A fair observation. Meanwhile, Meriwether Lewis continued documenting plants, animals, and geography whenever conditions allowed. Strange birds filled the river valleys. Massive fish moved beneath the muddy water. Endless herds of deer appeared along the shoreline, while unfamiliar animal tracks crossed the muddy banks near camp at night. The farther west they traveled, the more isolated the expedition became. Frontier settlements disappeared entirely. Signs of American civilization faded behind them mile by mile, until only wilderness surrounded the cause of discovery in every direction. At night, the men established camps beside the river beneath enormous skies stretching endlessly over the Ang plains. Fires burned low while guards stood watch against possible attacks, dangerous wildlife, or theft of supplies. The expedition remained heavily armed for good reason. Though Lewis and Clark hoped for peaceful relations with native nations, uncertainty followed them constantly. Rumors about powerful tribes along the Missouri circulated among the men around. Campfires each evening. Some stories described skilled traders and allies. Others described fierce warriors unwilling to tolerate armed strangers moving through their territories. Nobody knew what awaited them ahead, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on the expedition. Still moments of wonder broke through the hardship. Towering bluffs rose above the river valleys. Vast grasslands stretched beyond the horizon. The wilderness appeared immense beyond anything most Eastern Americans had imagined. The core of discovery was entering a world few citizens of the young United States had ever truly seen. And the deeper they traveled, the more impossible turning back began to feel. As the core of discovery pushed farther up the Missouri River, signs of another world began appearing around them. Not wilderness untouched by humans, but lands already known, traveled, hunted, and defended by native nations long before the United States had purchased maps full of optimistic blank spaces from France. Smoke sometimes rose in the distance beyond the plains. Trails crossed the river banks. Campsites appeared occasionally near the water. The expedition realized increasingly that they were not entering empty territory. They were entering someone else's homeland. Meriwether Lewis and William. Clark understood diplomacy would become just as important as survival. Skills. President Thomas Jefferson had instructed the expedition to establish peaceful relations with native tribes whenever possible, partly for trade, and partly because starting wars thousands of miles from reinforcements seemed strategically inconvenient. The expedition carried gifts specifically for these meetings: medals, tobacco, knives, beads, mirrors, cloth, and small American flags. The hope was simple: arrive politely, avoid dying. One afternoon, scouts spotted native hunters, watching the boats silently from distant hills above the river. The men aboard the keelboat immediately grew tense. Rifles were checked. Conversations quieted. Some soldiers stared nervously toward the shoreline. While pretending not to stare nervously toward the shoreline, the hunters eventually disappeared, without approaching. Still, the encounter unsettled the expedition because the core of discovery understood how vulnerable they truly were. The expedition remained isolated hundreds of miles from major settlements, traveling through unfamiliar territory with limited supplies and no easy route home if serious conflict erupted. Meanwhile, the river itself continued attacking morale, daily. Strong currents battered the keelboat, while hidden logs and sandby bars constantly threatened disaster. Several men suffered exhaustion from hauling the heavy vessel upstream, using ropes along muddy shorelines beneath crushing summer heat. Mosquitoes remained loyal enemies as well. At night, campfires flickered along the Missouri while Lewis recorded notes by candlelight, and Clark organized watches around the camp perimeter. Strange sounds drifted through the darkness: wolves howling, insects buzzing endlessly, branches cracking somewhere beyond the firelight. Some men struggled to sleep. Others spoke excitedly about the lands ahead. Because despite the fear and exhaustion, the expedition was witnessing landscapes few Americans had ever described properly. Endless grasslands rolled toward distant horizons, beneath enormous skies. Herds of buffalo appeared occasionally in staggering numbers across the plains. The West no longer felt imaginary. It felt vast, and somewhere ahead, beyond rivers and mountains still unseen, The expedition hoped a route to the Pacific Ocean waited patiently for them. The wilderness, unfortunately, had not yet been informed of these plans. Weeks into the journey, the landscape around the core of Discovery began changing dramatically. The dense forests along the lower Missouri slowly gave way to vast open plains stretching endlessly beneath enormous skies. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark now traveled through countries so wide and open that many of the men struggled to describe it properly in their journals. The land seemed almost endless. Rolling grasslands moved like waves beneath the wind, while distant hills shimmered under brutal summer heat. At night, stars filled the sky in numbers most Eastern Americans had never witnessed clearly before. There were no towns nearby, no church bells, no roads, only prairie and river, and silence occasionally interrupted by something large moving through the grass. The expedition soon encountered enormous buffalo herds crossing the plains around the Missouri River. Thousands upon thousands of animals thundered across the landscape in moving masses so large they temporarily stunned several members of the core of Discovery into silence, which was impressive. Frontier soldiers were not famously quiet men. The buffalo became both a food source and a danger. Hunters from the expedition shot animals regularly for meat, though approaching massive herds carried obvious risks. One wrong movement near a charging buffalo could flatten the man instantly beneath several thousand pounds of irritated muscle and horns. The wilderness increasingly reminded the expedition that humans were not automatically in charge everywhere. Meanwhile, river travel remained exhausting. Men continued dragging the keelboat against powerful currents, using ropes from the shoreline, while clouds of insects descended upon them relentlessly. Sweat-soaked clothing daily beneath the heavy summer air. Boots wore down. Supplies needed constant repair and protection from moisture. Still, morale improved occasionally during successful hunts or calm evenings beside the river. At night, campfires glowed across the plains, while soldiers roasted buffalo meat and discussed the strange new world unfolding around them. Some men spoke excitedly about fertile western lands and future settlements. Others worried about how much farther they still needed to travel before reaching the Pacific. The honest answer was deeply unpleasant. Very far. The expedition also began noticing signs of larger native populations nearby. Trails crossed the plains regularly. Smoke appeared on distant horizons. Lewis and Clark knew they were approaching, territories controlled by powerful nations along the Missouri. Diplomacy would soon become unavoidable and potentially dangerous, because while the core of Discovery viewed itself as a scientific mission, armed Americans traveling upriver into native territory could appear considerably less harmless from the other side of the conversation. Still, the expedition continued, westward through the immense plains beneath endless skies, pushing deeper into lands few citizens of the young United States had ever truly imagined. And the farther they traveled, the larger the continent itself seemed to become. By late summer, the core of Discovery approached one of the moments Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had been anticipating nervously for months: a formal meeting with native nations along the Missouri River. The expedition established camp near a bluff overlooking the river, while scouts searched for nearby villages belonging to the Ottawa Nation and the Missouri tribe. Smoke drifted across the distant plains while the men prepared carefully for first contact. Weapons were cleaned, uniforms were inspected, and several soldiers suddenly attempted to behave more professionally than they had at any previous point during the expedition, which was ambitious, considering most of them still smelled strongly of river mud and buffalo grease. Lewis and Clark understood the importance of these meetings. President Thomas Jefferson wanted peaceful relations with native nations throughout the Louisiana Territory. The expedition needed allies, trade opportunities, geographic knowledge, and safe passage through unfamiliar lands. The native nations, meanwhile, were meeting armed strangers arriving from an expanding foreign power, carrying flags, rifles, and political promises. A completely different perspective. When Ottawa and Missouri representatives finally arrived near camp, tension spread instantly through the cause of Discovery. Soldiers watched carefully while native leaders approached with calm confidence across the prairie. The Americans carried gifts and peace medals. The native delegates carried generations of knowledge about the land surrounding them. Both sides studied one another closely. Inside a temporary council area near the riverbank, Lewis and Clark conducted formal ceremonies involving speeches, trade items, and symbolic displays of friendship. American flags were presented, tobacco was shared, medals bearing Jefferson's image were distributed among tribal leaders. Translation proved slow and difficult. Entire political ideas had to travel awkwardly through multiple languages. While everyone attempted not to misunderstand one another catastrophically, still, the meeting remained peaceful. The native leaders observed the expedition carefully, while the Americans tried explaining the new political reality following the Louisiana Purchase. From the perspective of many native nations, however, foreign empires claiming ownership over distant territories they had never personally seen was hardly a new concept. Europeans had been doing that for centuries already. After the council, the atmosphere relaxed slightly. Trade continued around the camp, while members of the Corps of Discovery observed unfamiliar clothing, customs, and languages for the first time in the journey. That evening, campfires burned beside the Missouri River, while soldiers discussed the meeting quietly among themselves. The expedition had crossed an invisible line. Now they were no longer simply traveling through wilderness. They were moving through a complex human world, stretching far beyond the maps carried aboard their boats. As the Corps of Discovery continued westward along the Missouri River, the endless rhythm of rowing, hauling, hunting, and camping had begun to feel almost routine. An exhausting mosquito-infested routine, but still routine. Then one of the men became seriously ill. Charles Floyd, a young sergeant respected throughout the expedition, began suffering severe abdominal pain during the journey upriver. At first, the men hoped it was temporary sickness caused by heat, bad water, or spoiled food. All common frontier experiences unpleasant enough to become normal. But Floyd's condition worsened quickly. He grew weaker each day aboard the keelboat, while Meriwether Lewis attempted medical treatments using the limited knowledge and supplies available to frontier medicine in the early 19th century. Unfortunately, frontier medicine at the time often resembled highly organized guesswork. Lewis likely suspected some form of severe intestinal illness, though modern historians believe Floyd probably suffered from appendicitis, which today is dangerous but treatable. In 184, it was usually a death sentence. The expedition pushed urgently along the river, searching for a suitable campsite, while Floyd weakened beneath the brutal summer heat. The men aboard the boats grew quieter now. Conversations faded. Even the constant complaints about insects and rowing slowed noticeably, because for the first time the Corps of Discovery fully understood how isolated they truly were. There were no doctors nearby, no towns, no hospitals, only river and wilderness stretching endlessly, in every direction. Eventually, the expedition brought Floyd ashore near a bluff overlooking the Missouri River. The men gathered around helplessly, while Lewis and Clark stayed close beside the dying sergeant during his final hours. Floyd remained calm despite the pain. Shortly afterward, he died. The silence that followed settled heavily over the expedition camp. Many of the men had served together for months already. Floyd was respected, disciplined, and well-liked among the Corps of Discovery. His death reminded everyone how dangerous the journey ahead would become. If a healthy young soldier could die this early into the expedition, what waited farther west? The next day, the Corps of Discovery buried Sergeant Floyd on the bluff overlooking the river. They marked the grave carefully with cedar posts, while Clark recorded the location in his journal. It became the expedition's first and only death during the entire journey. Afterward, the men climbed back into the boats and continued westward against the current beneath the vast plain sky, because the river did not stop moving, and neither could they. After the burial of Charles Floyd, the Corps of Discovery pushed back onto the Missouri River beneath a noticeably different mood. The expedition still moved westward, but now the wilderness felt heavier, somehow more real. The death of Floyd had stripped away whatever romantic illusions remained about the journey ahead. This was no longer simply an adventure organized by Thomas Jefferson for maps and scientific curiosity. It was survival. And the farther west they traveled, the farther they moved beyond the reach of help, civilization, and certainty itself. The Missouri River continued winding endlessly through the Great Plains beneath immense skies and brutal summer heat. Day after day, the men rowed, hauled ropes, repaired equipment, hunted game, and fought the current inch by exhausting inch. Their clothing remained soaked with sweat and river water. Mosquitoes attacked relentlessly. Sandbars trapped the boats constantly, and still the expedition continued. William Clark maintained discipline carefully among the men, despite growing exhaustion. Guards remained posted every night. Weapons were inspected daily. Clark understood. Morale mattered almost as much as food supplies now. Meanwhile, Meriwether Lewis kept recording observations obsessively in his journals. Strange animals appeared along the plains. Vast buffalo herds darkened entire hillsides. Wolves followed camps at night, while enormous flocks of birds crossed the sky overhead. The scale of the continent stunned the expedition repeatedly. Eastern Americans had imagined the West, but imagination proved inadequate. The plains stretched farther than expected. The rivers were wider, the isolation deeper. Some evenings the men climbed bluffs overlooking the Missouri and saw nothing, except grasslands and sky extending endlessly toward the horizon. No roads, no cities, no boundaries, only wilderness. The core of discovery also understood they were approaching more powerful native nations farther upriver. Stories from traders and interpreters spoke of large villages, mounted warriors, and complex political alliances throughout the northern plains. Future encounters could shape the success or failure of the expedition entirely. Yet, despite fear, hardship, and uncertainty, excitement still survived among many of the men. They were witnessing landscapes almost no American citizens had ever described properly before. Every mile carried them deeper into a mapped territory toward mountains, rivers, and oceans still unseen. At night, campfires flickered beside the Missouri, while the expedition rested beneath cold stars over the open plains. And somewhere beyond the endless western horizon waited the Rocky Mountains. The maps became extremely nervous around that part.